spent nearly 12 years working in end-of-life care, mostly in home support, sometimes hospice. My job was never just about managing medication or keeping things clean and quiet. It was about presence. Real presence. Being there in the still moments, the forgotten corners of someone's final years, when masks fall away and what's left is only what's true. In that space, you learn to listen beyond words. One of the things I heard most, and not in pain but in a kind of worn-down whisper, was this: "I don't know why I always feel so tired after she visits." Or, "He means well, but I feel smaller every time he leaves." It wasn't about illness. It wasn't about physical exhaustion. It was emotional. The kind of drain that slowly seeps in when someone close to you, often someone you've known for decades, no longer meets you where you are. And for many older adults, that realization comes late. Quietly, almost guiltily. The truth is, not all friendships age well. And not all friends grow in the same direction. But we rarely talk about what happens when those very people, the ones you've shared birthdays, grandchildren, even grief with, start making you feel depleted. We don't want to believe it. We tell ourselves, "They've been through so much with me." Or, "They mean well, I shouldn't feel this way." But I've sat with enough elders to know, something doesn't have to be cruel to be draining. One woman I cared for, Mavis, 74, once described it like this: "It's like I'm holding a phone to my ear for an hour, but when I hang up, I can't remember a single thing that mattered." She was talking about her oldest friend, with whom she still had weekly chats. But those conversations had turned into loops, complaints, gossip, dismissive jokes. And Mavis, who had begun reflecting more, journaling quietly, finding peace in her garden and her books, said the calls left her with a headache in the soul. That stayed with me, because what Mavis was describing wasn't drama. It was disconnection, the first hidden sign. Sometimes we confuse closeness with history, but real closeness, especially after 60, requires emotional reciprocity. That gentle exchange where you both feel heard, where pauses are okay, where silence isn't awkward, but shared. Another man I worked with, Jerome, 79, was more blunt. "My best friend still thinks we're 35 and trying to out-talk each other over coffee," he told me. "But now I just want someone who'll listen without trying to fix me." Jerome had gone through 3 surgeries in 2 years. His world had quieted. His thoughts had deepened. But his friend, eager, loud, always offering solutions, left him feeling emotionally bulldozed every time they met. These stories repeat themselves more often than people expect. And because most seniors don't want to offend, they endure. They smile. They go home emotionally tired but say nothing. They mistake loyalty for permission to be drained. What I often told the families, and sometimes the elders themselves, is this: it's okay to adjust boundaries, even with people you've known your whole life. It's not disloyal to protect your energy. It's wise. That doesn't always mean cutting someone off. Sometimes it means changing the format, meeting in quieter settings, reducing the frequency, shifting the tone of what's shared. It also means noticing how you feel after someone leaves, not just during the visit. Another subtle sign I've seen: laughter that doesn't feel nourishing anymore. Sounds strange, I know, but many older adults have told me they still laugh with certain friends, yet they feel hollow inside afterward. I once asked a retired therapist in her early 80s about it. She said, "Some laughter is just avoidance wearing a mask." What she meant was, not all laughter is joyful. Sometimes it's a shield, a script, a way to cover the growing mismatch in emotional depth. You crack the same jokes. You laugh at the same old stories. But you walk away wondering why you feel alone in a room that was full of noise. That too is a sign. When you reach this stage of life, you're not looking to impress anymore. You want truth, stillness, a sense that your words land somewhere soft. And if a friend, even one you love deeply, consistently leaves you feeling misunderstood or unseen, it's worth noticing. Gently, honestly, without shame. Because the relationships that last aren't just the ones with the most memories. They're the ones that still fit who you're becoming. And becoming doesn't stop at 60. It never stops. There's a pattern I've noticed quietly, across hundreds of homes, across dozens of different personalities, faiths, families. The people who feel most emotionally nourished in older age are not always the ones with the busiest calendars, or the most children, or the loudest dinner tables. They're the ones who've learned the difference between connection and obligation. They're the ones who no longer confuse noise with love. A man I cared for, William, 76, lived alone after his wife passed. His daughter visited once a week. His neighbor brought groceries. But what made his face light up was a once-a-month visit from an old coworker named Ruth. She didn't bring anything. They didn't talk much, but she sat with him, asked him one question: "What's been on your heart lately?" and listened. He told me once, "That visit gives me more life than 5 phone calls full of updates I didn't ask for." That too is a sign. The presence that restores versus the presence that depletes. One of the more hidden drains I often saw came from friendships where one person had stopped evolving, but the other had not. You'd see it when one person became more contemplative, more inward-facing, more emotionally honest, while the other remained locked in the same old emotional language: sarcasm, control, comparison. Linda, 81, said to me one afternoon, "My friend makes me feel guilty for growing softer." She meant it sincerely. Since turning 75, Linda had taken up morning journaling, started attending a poetry group, and told me she'd cried more in the last 2 years. Not from sadness, but release, than in the 2 decades before. But her old friend of 40 years constantly teased her for being too sentimental, mocked her when she said she was cutting back on social events to enjoy quiet, dismissed her new sensitivity as a phase. That's another sign, and not always easy to name. The subtle shaming of who you are becoming. Sometimes we outgrow people not because they harm us, but because they no longer know how to honor us. And that grief, because it is grief, is rarely validated. You don't get flowers or a sympathy card for losing emotional compatibility with someone you've loved for years. You just feel it in your body, in the way you flinch before answering the phone, in the way your heart drops at their jokes that once made you laugh, in the way you go quiet in conversations where you once felt alive. That's what I mean by draining, not in the dramatic sense, but in the deeply personal, cumulative one. The slow leak of spirit, the weariness that comes from never feeling fully seen. I remember once speaking with a hospice nurse, Angela, who had worked with over 300 patients. She told me, toward the end, the ones who are at peace have a very short list of people they want near them. And those people aren't always who you'd expect. I asked her what made the difference. She paused and said, "It's the people who make them feel like they're allowed to be who they are, right now, not who they were or who someone else wants them to be." I think of that often when seniors tell me they feel tired after being with certain old friends. It's not the company itself. It's the cost of staying small in that company. And here's the hard part. Many elders blame themselves. They think they're becoming antisocial, or too sensitive, or too set in their ways. But what I've seen time and again is that after 60, your emotional filter becomes more refined, not less. You stop chasing stimulation. You start craving sincerity. And any friendship, no matter how long-standing, that doesn't meet you there, begins to feel like a burden you don't want to carry anymore. It's not unkind to notice that. It's wisdom. If you're still here, feel free to leave your thoughts below. I read each one with care. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't show on the outside. It's not in the muscles or the bones. It's quieter than that. A subtle emotional weight that settles in your chest after being with someone who never quite meets you halfway. I've seen it often, especially in older adults who've learned to tough things out. Many come from a generation that valued perseverance. You didn't cut ties. You didn't complain. You adapted. But what happens when the adaptation becomes erosion? One woman, Jeanette, age 78, put it this way: "I spend an hour with her, and I feel like I've lost a part of myself I just spent the morning trying to reclaim." She was referring to her oldest friend, a woman she'd known since high school. They'd shared everything: marriages, divorces, funerals, recipes, parenting woes. But as they aged, Jeanette started investing in her spiritual life. She became quieter, more attuned to small joys, more protective of her mornings. Her friend, however, had grown louder, more opinionated, more bitter about the world, more attached to gossip and complaint. After each visit, Jeanette said she'd feel like she had to rinse her soul. That's the kind of subtle damage that accumulates, especially after 60, when your inner life becomes more precious than ever before. Another sign, perhaps the most overlooked one, is when a friend keeps seeing you as someone you no longer are. This happens more than you might think. Raymond, 83, told me once over a quiet afternoon, "Every time I talk to George, it's like he's speaking to the 40-year-old version of me. The one who drank too much and didn't know how to apologize. I've worked so hard to become someone better. But with him, it's like none of that counts." What Raymond described is something I've come to recognize as identity stagnation, when a relationship locks you in a version of yourself that you've outgrown. That can be deeply painful, especially for people who've done the hard work of self-reflection, forgiveness, and emotional growth. To be seen only for who you were and not who you are now is its own kind of loneliness. And yet, many seniors tolerate this, because there's guilt in letting go of someone who's done nothing obviously wrong. But the truth is, emotional alignment matters more than loyalty to outdated versions of ourselves. That doesn't mean you need to cut ties in dramatic fashion. In fact, most of the healthiest seniors I've worked with don't sever relationships, they recalibrate them. They shift the depth, the rhythm, the expectation. Instead of meeting weekly, maybe it becomes once every few months. Instead of deep conversation, the connection becomes lighter, more situational. Instead of dragging the friendship into present-day relevance, they let it rest gently in the past, honoring what it was without forcing it to be what it no longer is. That kind of gentle release takes maturity and courage. I remember a therapist in his late 70s once telling me, "You can love someone without keeping them close. You can forgive someone and still choose silence. That's not bitterness. That's discernment." That perspective stayed with me, especially as I noticed how many elders carry invisible tension in their long-term friendships, smiling through visits, but counting the minutes until they're alone again. These aren't failed friendships. They're friendships that need new containers. And that's part of aging wisely, realizing not all love is meant to be active forever. Some of it belongs in memory. Some of it shifts into a quieter form. And some of it simply fades, not out of resentment but out of reverence for the person you've become. There's no manual for how to handle this. No checklist for when it's time to step back. But if your body feels tighter after a visit, if your mind replays what you wish you'd said, if your heart feels a little less full than it did before, pay attention, because how you feel after time with someone is the truest reflection of what that relationship is now. And you deserve to feel like yourself when you walk away. Not smaller, not heavier, not erased. Your emotional space, especially after 60, is sacred. Let it be filled only by those who see you clearly. One of the most misunderstood dynamics I've witnessed in long-term friendships among seniors is what I quietly call emotional mismatching. It's subtle, hard to name, but you feel it in the pauses that never quite land, in the laughter that doesn't echo, in the way a story you find profound gets met with distraction or dismissal. In one visit, I was supporting a woman named Carla, age 82. She had become increasingly reflective in her final years, writing poetry, rereading old letters, listening to soft jazz in the mornings. Her emotional world had deepened, slowed, gained layers. But every Thursday, her friend Ellen would visit and immediately fill the room with sound. Fast stories, strong opinions, loud greetings. At first, Carla said she welcomed the distraction. But over time, she began to feel something she hadn't expected, a kind of emotional dissonance. "She fills the space so fast," Carla told me. "I forget what I was feeling before she arrived." That sentence struck me, because sometimes the most draining friendships are the ones that don't feel obviously toxic. They feel loud, well-meaning, even helpful, but they interrupt our internal rhythm. After 60, your emotional rhythm shifts. You begin to crave spaciousness, not only in your day, but in your conversations. You want someone who can sit with your pauses, not race ahead of them, Another hospice volunteer once shared with me a reflection from a patient in his late 80s who had grown distant from his oldest friend. Not because of a fight, but because, as he said, "He keeps pulling me back to things I've already let go of." That's another hidden sign of emotional drain. Being constantly pulled back to mental places you've moved beyond. This can look like friends who insist on revisiting old regrets you've made peace with, conversations that circle old wounds you no longer wish to carry, jokes that reduce you to a version of yourself you've worked to outgrow. In those moments, you may feel like you're playing a role in a play you've long since exited, wearing a costume that doesn't fit anymore. You smile, you nod, you change the subject, but inside, something in you quietly recedes. And if that feeling happens often, that subtle inner retreat, it matters. Because your peace is not something to compromise just to maintain familiarity. One of the most courageous things I've seen seniors do is learn to be honest with themselves about which connections actually bring them peace, and which ones only pretend to. It doesn't always mean confrontation. In fact, most don't need that. More often, it means making small, kind decisions, declining a visit when your energy feels fragile, shifting a phone call to a shorter window, changing the setting from a loud cafe to a quiet walk, or sometimes just letting the conversation become less frequent without guilt. When I worked with couples in late-stage care, one of the most heartbreaking yet freeing moments came when a spouse would admit, "I'm not the person they need to be around right now," and that's okay. It takes maturity to acknowledge that even love, deep, real love, doesn't always mean compatibility, especially as we age and the seasons of our soul change. One man, a retired social worker, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Some friendships are fires, some are gardens. You have to know which ones warm you, and which ones you're just constantly trying to keep alive. That's the question, isn't it? Is this connection giving you warmth? Or are you the one adding all the wood?" Because if you're always tending, always adjusting, always managing their energy before your own, that is not a friendship. That is emotional labor disguised as loyalty. And after 60, your energy becomes a sacred currency. Spend it where it returns to you, not just where it has history. Because peace at this stage of life is not a luxury. It's a need. And the people who drain it, no matter how long they've known you, are not entitled to keep it. There's something beautifully quiet about getting older. Not just in the way your mornings slow down or how your calendar softens, but in the way your priorities shift from being liked by many to being understood by a few. And that shift often brings with it a realization: not all friendships are meant to age with you. One man I worked with, Harold, 85, told me something after a long silence while we sat on his porch one afternoon. He said, "You spend your youth trying to belong. You spend your later years trying to feel whole. That distinction matters. In younger decades, we tolerate a lot. We make ourselves more flexible, more available, more agreeable, all in the name of keeping the group intact. Friendships often survive because of momentum, not meaning. But once you cross into your 60s and beyond, something else calls to you. Stillness, simplicity, sincerity, and the friendships that don't reflect that begin to feel like echoes, familiar but no longer full. One of the most common regrets I've heard from people in their final years isn't that they ended a friendship, but that they held on to ones that quietly wore them down. Out of duty, out of fear, out of guilt. They didn't leave because there was no big reason. But sometimes the small reasons repeated over and over are enough. The sigh after the visit, the emotional hangover the next day, the smile that feels like a mask, the conversations that skim the surface when your heart longs for depth. These aren't trivial details. They are signs, gentle ones, but still worth listening to. So what do you do with this? You don't have to cut people off. You don't have to issue explanations or rehearse difficult speeches. What you can do is start by honoring your own internal compass. If a relationship consistently drains your energy, it's okay to loosen your grip. If you find yourself pretending in order to protect someone else's comfort, it's okay to stop performing. If you walk away from a conversation feeling unseen, unheard, or unheld, it's okay to choose less of it. That is not cruelty. That is kindness toward yourself. And something remarkable happens when you do this. You begin to make space. Not just physical space in your calendar, but emotional space in your spirit. And into that space, something new can grow. Sometimes it's a quieter friendship. A neighbor who doesn't need loud laughter, just warm tea and shared silence. Sometimes it's your own company finally free from the need to perform. And sometimes, rarely beautifully, it's someone who arrives late in your life but sees you exactly as you are now. Not as you were, not as they wish you were, but as you've become. That kind of friendship isn't built on time. It's built on truth. And at this stage of life, truth is the deepest form of connection. So if you're noticing these signs, if someone you once loved now leaves you feeling emptied, you're not broken. You're becoming more whole. And in that becoming, it's okay to choose peace. It's okay to love someone and still step back. It's okay to outgrow what once fit perfectly. It's okay to protect your stillness. Because stillness is not the absence of people. It's the presence of peace. And you deserve that, especially now. If this kind of quiet reflection feels helpful to you, you're welcome to come back anytime. I'll be here,